Hi, and welcome to the 51st in our Middle Eastern history series. Can you believe it? We've actually been going on since July of 2021. This is the episode on modern Iran, the reign of Reza Shah Pahlavi. Reza Shah Pahlavi was in power from 1921 until 1941. So it's about that 40-year, it's about that 20-year period. That's what we're going to be covering today mostly. And the rules, for those of you who are unfamiliar, this is not an academic presentation. I'm not accredited in history, religion, politics, or any of the topics that we're going to be discussing tonight. I'm going to try and give this presentation from a secular perspective. I'm going to try and be even-handed with the sources as best I can. That said, of course, this is a difficult topic, so let's be respectful of different views. That said, I love interactivity, questions, comments, clarifications. Please put those in the chat. I do read the chat and will respond in real time. I also like to say that these presentations are a 101 and a 201. A 101 meaning that if you don't know anything, I'll try and catch you up. And if you already know something, I'll probably tell you something you didn't know. That's the 201. I also say that there's going to be a 2-hour hard stop, which means that regardless of how many slides we've done, if it hits the 2-hour mark, I will not be presenting any more slides. I will finish any questions and discussion that we may have, but you know that after 2 hours, 9 p.m. Eastern time, that we will be done. It's a display of respect for both your life outside of this and my life outside of this. When I put dates below a person, that is their years of service. It is not necessarily their birth or death years. And finally, this is a recording, which means that you can watch it later. You can also watch the other 50 previous episodes that get us to where we are today, like episode 42, which is a direct lead-in to this episode. What I like to do is I try to get all the regions of the Middle East before I advance in terms of time, because all these regions are so closely connected. So that's why it was 9 episodes ago that we last were in Iran. That said, if you want to watch this later or you want to watch any of our other series, please go to our YouTube and subscribe to our YouTube channel. I will put the information in the comments. And of course, we really appreciate PayPal donations. They help us maintain the YouTube Premium that we have, the Zoom, and the meetup costs that are associated with this free programming. All right. So one of the things that we talked about sort of moving into the 19th century was that there was an expansion by the Russians in the north and the British in the east, chipping away at Persian territory. And you can see even in bigger relief, these two great powers, Russia and Britain, playing what they called the Great Game. The British extending their colonial empire from the Bengal, which is that area shared by Bangladesh and India, all across the Indian subcontinent and towards Iran, and the Russians expanding from St. Petersburg south into the east, and those territories, and those countries taking over territories that were historically part of the Iranian sphere, until Iran itself was divided into spheres of influence by the Tsarist Russians and the British. And we talked about how in the early Qajar period, the Qajars had inherited a broken Iran that had fought numerous civil wars since the death of Nadir Shah in 1747. And Iran had divided into a number of quasi-independent autonomous regions, primarily ruled by the Persian nomads. And as long as these nomads paid taxes to the Shah, it was deemed that they were loyal, and therefore they were allowed to continue their autonomy. So in truth, we didn't have a united Persian state under the Qajar Dynasty. We had a number of different autonomous states that were sort of in league with each other. A good example today might be Switzerland, but Switzerland has a lot more unity at this point because of modern communications. At this point in Iranian history, roughly 1/3 of all Iranians are nomadic. And the vast majority of the settled Iranians live in small villages as opposed to major cities. And so the connectivity during the 19th century between the various entities throughout Iran, especially during the reign of Pahlavi Shah, was very minimal. And during the 19th century, we really see that the relationship that the various powers will have to Persia is much more dependent on Persia's relation on the various powers' relationship to each other in Europe. So you have a situation where the Persians meet with the French and they have good relations with the French, and then suddenly, because of the situation in Europe, they have good relations with the British, and then the British and Russians end up having an alliance against Napoleon, and so they have to default back to the French. So you have this repetitive situation where the Iranians really feel like they are unimportant in the eyes of the great imperial powers. The Russians fight a lot of advances in the 19th century, resulting in what is called the Treaty of Turkmenchai, in which the majority of the Persian Caucasus becomes ceded to the Russian Empire. And in addition to these cessions, which is the eastern half of Georgia, the modern countries of Armenia and Azerbaijan, and some of the southern territories of Russia, such as Dagestan, you have what are called the capitulations and indemnity payments. So not only is Qajar Iran defeated by the Tsarist Russians, they demand special access to businesses within the country. They demand tribute payments, indemnity payments for the losses that they'd sustained during the wars. And one of the requirements of the Treaty of Turkmenchai was that that the Russians would have more influence than the British would have. And so the British couldn't support the Persians against this new economic onslaught, as well as this political machination that the Russians were going to do with respect to Iran. One of the important points to make during the Qajar period is that there was no infrastructure built during the Qajar period. In fact, the only train line that really existed throughout the 19th century was a 5-kilometer train that went from the center of Tehran to the shrine of Shah Abdulazim. Today, that shrine is actually within metropolitan Tehran. So that should give you an idea of just how disconnected this country was. Throughout the 19th century, as we remember, the Ottoman Empire is building railway. The Egyptians are building railway. But the Qajar are simply not modernizing. The Qajar Shahs themselves are not very forward-thinking, and within the court, there's a lot of pressure from both the British and Russians to abandon any positive developments. We talked about, for example, the Prime Minister Akbar, and he tried to make several changes, but the British basically conspired to have him assassinated. So, by and large, these Shahs did not make the necessary internal developments, and they kept taking out loans from the Russians and the British in order to support their very affluent lifestyle. At the same time, in order to increase the wealth coming into Persia, the government was willing to sign a number of concessions. These were permissions for Europeans, primarily British, but it could be other Europeans as well, to have exclusive monopolies or rights over certain aspects of the Iranian economy. The one in particular that was seen as satanic by many of the religious leaders in Iran was the concession given to Baron Paul Julius von Reuter. This is the same Reuter who founded the Reuter News Agency. He was a German Jew, but he had migrated to the United Kingdom and settled down there. And his concession was to build railways throughout the entirety of Iran. But it was deeply detested. As I said, to give so much power to a foreigner was seen as satanic among many of the Mujtaheds, the Muslim clerical leaders. And so there were protests all up and throughout the country. So the Shah at the time, Nasruddin, decided to cancel the concession and instead give him a different concession to build the Imperial Bank of Persia. This became the currency issuer for the entirety of the Qajar Empire. So just to be clear, right, we have now a British individual who's responsible for the entire printing of Persian money within the Persian ecosystem. At the same time, we see the Russians coming from the north in Central Asia. There's a question of what was the complaint about the development? It's not so much that it would be developed that people were complaining about, although that certainly was part of it. A significant part of it was that they didn't have power over designating how it would work. Also, they had no control over how much it would cost to implement it. And they felt like it was the surrender of their territory to these foreign forces that had demonstrated through their repeated conquest, through their creation of militias that were operating in Iran, that they were not interested in the long-term survival and benefit of the Iranian people. So the Russians were coming from the north, and by 1884, the Russians had taken all of Central Asia, defeating a number of distinct khanates and independent states, like Khiva, like Bukhara, like Khojaand, in this region, and coming to an agreement with the British after the Panjshir incident of 1885 that Afghanistan would come under the British sphere of influence, and the Soviets would not, the Tsarist Russians would not expand into that territory. One concession that was particularly pressing and got the attention of both the major merchants and of the Mujtahids was the Imperial Tobacco Corporation of 1890. You can see that's actually a share from the corporation. And it was a British corporation that had the concession over all tobacco to be bought and sold within Iran. Now, from the merchant perspective, this concession was very damning in the sense that it destroyed many businesses, because a number of businesses sold tobacco. Tobacco was relatively good business within Persia. And so they were rioting because they felt that the Shah had unfairly removed their economic ability to profit. On the flip side, you have the situation from the Mujtahids, from the Muslim clerics, and the issue for them was that increasingly Iranians had less and less control over their own future. And so you have the Grand Ayatollah, who is one of the foremost Mujtahids within Iran, Muhammad Hassan Ashirazi, and he publishes a fatwa, or a religious decision, against using tobacco. This is the actual fatwa he published, and in it he makes clear that anybody who is smoking is violating the laws of Islam, because it's against the rights and liberation of the Iranian people. And so you can see already in this pre-modern period that the Mujtahids have an incredible amount of political clout. And in fact, even people within the Sultan's own retinue would refuse to smoke tobacco because of how strong the reach of Ashirazi was in terms of his ability to affect public opinion. And accordingly, the imperial tobacco concession was canceled, but not without significant ire from the British, to whom it had been granted. Now, in order to keep law and order, as I said, the imperialist powers began to create militaries or militias within Iran that would be subservient to their interests. And the Russians went forward and created the most advanced of these, and that was the Persian Cossacks. It was based on the same kind of regimentation and uniforms of the Don Cossacks within Russia, although there's no biological relation between the two organizations. The Persian Cossacks were Persians ethnically, as well as a number of other minorities like Circassian Muhajirs, right? Individuals who had left Circassia and now had settled in Iran, as well as Turkic-speaking Iranians. All these groups came together, but they would be led by Russian leaders. And you can see Lyakov on the above, and you can see Kosogovsky to the left of him, these were two different Russian commanders who oversaw the unit. And it was clear that this unit would be entirely at the direction of the Russians. Mirza Ali Ashgar Khan, who's known by his title as Amin Sultan, was the prime minister at this point, and he permitted the Cossacks to be formed, and he considered that the Russians would have the permission to operate within the territory of Qajar Iran. Now, of course, this was negatively viewed by the people, but the Cossacks were incredibly well trained and therefore not susceptible to the public's dislike of them. Now, another piece that we need to sort of remember from the Qajar days is the Darcy concession. So you had William Knox Darcy. He was a British industrialist, and he got a concession to look within almost all the territory of Iran. There's a question here: did the Qajars not have a military? The Qajars absolutely did have a military, but we need to understand two important things about it. The first is, as I said, Iran under the Qajar period was divided into numerous different regions that were overseen by various different local governors. Those local governors generally came from the nomadic populations that lived interspersed with the settled populations in the rural areas. And so the militaries that were primarily organized during this period were organized by these governors, not by the Qajar ruler in Tehran. So, for example, the princes of Iranian Azerbaijan, which is in the northwest of the country, those tended to have much larger militaries than, let's say, those in the southeast of the country, Balochistan, which is the area that borders with Pakistan, right? So those were the militaries, and the Shah would call upon these groups to defend him. So that's the first issue. So the Shah didn't really have a significantly large army of his own. He had an army that he could call upon. The second major issue is that the British and the Russians are significantly better armed than the military of the Qajar. If we go back to episode 42, and I talk about it more in depth, the equipment that the British have in terms of artillery, in terms of modern guns, in terms of the ability to deploy, all of these different things are much better than anything that the Qajar could bring to bear. And so from a military perspective, there wasn't anything to do. And furthermore, in many cases, the British and Russian loans were propping up the Qajar lifestyle. So it was against the interests of the Qajar Shahs to actually fight off the imperialist yoke, because they were benefiting from it. It was the general population that was more and more incensed by this and had really no effective mechanism to remove it. And I have another question of how many concessions were granted under duress. I'm not aware of any concession at this period in history that was, British or Russian person holds a gun to the Shah's head and says, grant us this concession or your head goes off. So we don't have duress at that level. But absolutely, a lot of the loans that were given to the Qajar Shahs were made conditional on the provision of concessions, because increasingly, as more and more of these loans were given, it became very clear to the British and to the Russians that they couldn't be paid back. So if they can't be paid back, how could you derive revenue? Well, you'd create a concession. So that's generally the way that these came about. And you could say that that's under duress because the Shah needed this money in order to live. He spent it frivolously, but he needed it in order to live. And so he sort of caused the situation himself. Or you can look at it that the imperialists knew exactly what they were doing by giving him this money, getting him into a situation that he couldn't walk out of. And because of that, they could take advantage. And that's generally the Iranian perspective on the matter. So, as I was saying, William Knox Darcy was a British industrialist. And he was responsible for this massive concession that would be responsible for generating the oil revenues. And at that time, Iran was not known as a place that would have oil. And so Darcy actually spent nearly 7.5 years looking for oil throughout the region of Iran. And literally, as he was about to give up in the southern region of, on this map, it's labeled as Arabistan, but in modern Iran, it's labeled as Khuzestan. He found oil. And not only did he find oil, he found one of the largest deposits of oil that has ever been discovered. And so the British ended up negotiating with the local Arab population. Now, Iran is mostly non-Arab, right? Iran is only 2% Arab as a total. But if we're talking about this region of Arabistan, of Khuzestan, this region is, at least at this point, at least majority Arab, if not super majority Arab. And that the Arabs are the ones in political power, certainly. So the British end up negotiating with the Arabs there in order to extract the oil. They did not negotiate with the government in Tehran. They had already gotten the concession, so they were permitted to extract, but it was with the Arabs that they felt they needed to negotiate because that was the local power source, right? That was the group that was most likely to cause a problem. And the Arabs agreed that if the British would help defend them against any possible encroachment on their local sovereignty, that they would permit the British to build without issue a refinery at Abadan, which is a small island off the coast of Arabistan, where all of this oil could be brought together and then shipped out from the country. This, the creation of Abadan refinery and the collection of petroleum that went along with it was the foundation of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which still survives to this day, although today it's known as Beyond Petroleum. So because of this confluence of factors, you end up having a situation where the Mujtahids and even the merchants and even the most liberal intelligentsia of society were all in agreement. The stars had just aligned, and there was a revolution in 1905. And the Mujtahids really became the voice of the revolution. They demanded a better system, and in particular, they demanded that there would be the creation of an adalat khaneh, meaning a house of justice, literally, but in function it referred to a parliament, and that the power of the Shah would be constrained. And this parliament, which eventually got the title of Majlis, was convened at first in 1906, and it had a number of indirect election mechanisms, but it effectively resulted in 3 dominant parties coming to the fore, or dominant coalitions of parties, is probably better to say. The most numerous were the moderates, led by Behbehani, and this group wanted to modernize Iran, but it was also considered important Western human rights and norms, and so was trying to balance those and understood those within a Muslim context. You had more extremists on the left wing, like Taghi-Zadeh, who were trying to create a modern Europeanist state. You can think very similar to Ataturk that we talked about last week. And on the more conservative side, you have royalists like Nouri, who you can see there, who wanted to really shore up the power of the Shah and did not want to engage in liberal reforms and constitutionalism. But generally speaking, the moderates and the liberals worked together to sort of create a system that would be moving towards progress. And unfortunately for them, that progress came exactly at the point where the British and the Russians made an agreement in 1907, where they signed the Anglo-Russian Convention and divided Iran into spheres of influence. So finally, the contest between the great powers was over. the two imperialists were now on the same side, and that side was against Iranian sovereignty. And so the Russians, with British permission, began to militarize the Cossacks, the Persian Cossacks that they created, and began to shell the Majlis and arrest the constitutionalists. They then put Shah Muhammad Ali in power. He was a Qajar monarch that the Russians could control, and there was fighting back and forward. But that was not the end of the revolution. You had a number of Persians who began to ally themselves with a number of tribesmen, and they overtook the capital in 1910 and reestablished the revolution. Sorry, in 1909, and they reestablished the revolution called the Triumph in Tehran. And at this point, during the constitutional period, is when you have the greatest amount of relations between the Americans and the Persians that we've seen so far. The Persians at this period are really inspired by Woodrow Wilson's words that every population is entitled to self-determination, and they see his words as being in alignment with their goals of creating an independent and free Iran. Now, while Woodrow Wilson had not uttered these yet, they were certainly in the spirit of what Americans were saying at the time. And so they asked for W. Morgan Schuster to come and be a financial accountant, help balance the budget, set up modern industries and organization within the new constitutional monarchy. And he did that until he was forcibly ousted by the Cossacks, who attacked again at Russian command to remove the Majlis and compel his removal as well. In fact, he wrote about how the Russians, with British permission, were responsible for this destruction in his famous book, The Strangling of Persia. And you can see when the Russians entered the city of Tabriz, which was one of the most left-leaning cities within Iran, one of the most liberal cities, the revolutionaries were hung by the Russians. That's not to say that there wasn't British influence as well. Of course, we already talked about the Anglo-Persian oil company, and you can see that's a tanker from them. You can also see that the British had to respond to a number of internal groups that were still fighting, and they would fight against both the British and the newly instated Russian monarchy. For example, you have Qajar Khan and the Jangali. We're going to talk about them a little bit more in detail in a few minutes. And you have even attacks at the Imam Reza Shrine in Mashhad. And the Imam Reza Shrine, like most of the shrines in Iran, is what's considered best. And best is a Persian word meaning a place of refuge, a place of protection. So when Russians and British shelled different shrines, like the Imam Reza Shrine, for example, it was seen as both sacrilegious and deeply offensive to the Iranian spirit. That said, the British and Russians often found it expedient to not respect this historic Persian custom of allowing people to take refuge in the mosques. And finally, of course, there's Lionel Dunsterville, the British colonel who was the creator of the British general who was responsible for his creation of what are known as the Dunster Force. And they were moving about Persia. Their numbers are in the few thousands. And it was a British unit primarily made of both Anglo-Brits and Indians. And they also kept sort of peace within the country in the sense of restraining the revolutionary impulses to the best that they could. Of course, remember, when we say revolution, we're talking about those in favor of Persian constitutionalism, those in favor of the 1905 revolution. And so then World War I hit Persia. Now, Persia was neutral in World War I, but that didn't stop it from being one of the most suffering one of the worst calamities of World War I, certainly for any neutral state, the possible exception being Belgium. There were invasions by Ottomans and Germans into Persian territory. The Germans in particular sent Wilhelm Wasmus, who you can see there. He is sort of called the German Lawrence of Arabia, in that he was able to talk to a number of tribes, especially in Lorestan and in Kermanshah, which you can see on the map of Iran, very close to the Iraqi border. Those are areas with large minority populations, primarily Kurds and Lurs. And he was able to create alliances with them to try and extend German influence in Iran. At the same time, you have Russians sending their own troops, as well as Assyrian troops that were working with the Russians. Assyrians are a Christian minority from this region. And so those Assyrian militias combined with the Russian soldiers would meet the Ottomans in in Persian territory, resulting in numerous clashes between German and Ottoman forces on one side, and then these Russian and Russian-aligned forces on the other. Not to be outdone, the British started to form their own militias, especially with the Qashqai ethnicity, primarily in the region of Boyar Ahmad and in Fars. And these Qashqai are a nomadic Turkic group, and together they formed what were called the Southern Rifles. And the Southern Rifles would end up fighting against Wilhelm Wasmus's confederation of various Lurish and Kurdish groups. Accordingly, Iran was actually the site of a number of important battles throughout World War I. But the real cost to Iran was not these particular battles. The real cost to Iran was the devastation of the countryside and the loss of Russian trade. To the latter, Russia, when it had its revolution in 1917, effectively cut off all trade with all other countries because of the internal struggle within the country to contain the October Revolution in 1917. Now, prior to World War I, 63% of Persian trade had been with Russia. So you can imagine the massive economic downturn that triggered within Iran. And when merchants couldn't afford to buy goods and provide the necessary implements for farming, combined with an incredibly dry season that year, there was a massive famine that occurred from 1917 to 1919. It's estimated that the famine was responsible for the deaths of between 1.5 and 2 million Iranians throughout the country. So in addition to the chaos from the war, which prevented people from getting necessary help, and the economic downturn caused by the Russian Revolution, Iran suffered tremendously as a result of the First World War, and Iran was in a state of disarray, unlike anything that had existed during the 19th century. There's a comment here that Churchill and Stalin had the secret percentages agreement to split Eastern Europe. That would come later, but it's the same sort of idea. Now, I mentioned General Lionel Dunsterville, and during World War I, as we mentioned in episode 49, you had the Caucasian Wars. Now, Lionel Dunsterville took his forces from Anzali over water, over the Caspian Sea, to land at Baku and support the Central Caspian dictatorship. At the same time, the Ottomans were moving into what was formerly northern Iran and the areas that were the Southern Caucasus, the historic parts of the Russian Empire. Because the Russian Empire had dissolved, these territories were now under their own leadership, which was relatively flimsy. As I talked about in episode 49, it is a very complicated and detailed situation. But what's important to take away from it are a few points for Iran. The first is that Ottomans were penetrating the northern border of Iranian Azerbaijan repeatedly. They had besieged the city of Tabriz, they'd taken the city of Khoy, and a number of other cities in the northern part, the northwestern part of Iran. In fact, you can see it on the map on the left-hand side, all those areas where the Ottomans have that sort of a semicircle and an arrow down in red Those are cities controlled by the Ottomans that are within sovereign Iranian territory. Now, the other major piece that's worth, other than the fact that the Dunster force was now outside of Iranian territory, the other major piece is that for the first time in history, the land north of the Aras River, what we today call the Republic of Azerbaijan, this was the first time that it got the title Azerbaijan. Historically, that region was known as Aras or as Shirvan, or it was known by the two governorates that composed it, the governorate of Ganja, or the governorate of Elizabethpol in other sources, and the governorate of Baku. So this name, Azerbaijan, caused a lot of consternation within Iran because the northwestern region of Iran, that's the southern side of the Aras River, had historically been called Azerbaijan for centuries. And it was believed by many in Iran that the north of the Aras River Azerbaijanis wanted to annex the south of the river Azerbaijanis, which is something that the southerners did not want at all. So far, since that point till today, the Northern Republic has not made any direct overtures to do this, but the name was very controversial at the time it was brought about. So in 1919, we have a new situation. Now, one of the things that I didn't mention during the World War I is that in 1915, the British expand their sphere of influence with permission of the Russians. And the Russians expand their own sphere of influence slightly, but now it wasn't just that the British were controlling the southeastern part of Iran, they were now controlling the entire south of Iran. Following the Russian Revolution in 1917, the Soviets had no interest in reclaiming the Russian sphere of influence, which meant that now the British were in an ideal position to create a protectorate over all of Iran and absorb it, similar to the mandates that they were creating in the other parts of the Middle East, places like Palestine, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq. Seeing the weakness of Ahmad Shah Qajar, who was the last Qajar monarch, Lord Curzon promoted a secret agreement, the 1919 Anglo-Persian agreement. And what the British really wanted, in addition to direct control as a protectorate, would be accessing all the Iranian oil fields. Now, the British were willing to make some concessions. They were going to supply munitions for a British-trained and ultimately British-controlled military, provide £2 million for the necessary reforms. In fact, much of that $2 million would go to pay the British staffers who'd be responsible for training the army, revising the customs tariff to allow Persia to make a little bit more money on customs, and to build railroads throughout the country. But it's not just the demand on total Persian sovereignty that bothered many Persians of the day, despite one of the fundamental issues that a lot of Persians saw was that bribes were used to get the agreement passed by the higher levels of government. Now, the Soviet Union, to the extent that it existed in 1919, remember, this is in the middle of the Russian Civil War, so the Soviet Union only controls parts of the territory, and they certainly don't control any of the territory that would be adjacent to the Iranian border. But they do control some areas on the Caspian Sea. The Soviets have an anti-imperialist doctrine that they begin to espouse, holding that the rest of the world will also follow them in a socialist revolution and become part of the worldwide Comintern, or Communist International. Now, accordingly, their view was that the Persians should be able to create their own country free of foreign influence, and that would naturally join with the other Soviets. So, despite the fact that Lord Curzon had negotiated this 1919 agreement, that agreement was deeply unpopular with everybody but Ahmad Shah Qajar. And accordingly, the British wanted to find a way to, at least for the moment, solidify control. So in 1920, General Ironside, who was the British leader within Iran at this point, He had the nickname Tiny because at his 6'4" height, he was much smaller than his surrounding compatriots. Sorry, that's a joke. I should have been a little clearer. But Edmund Ironside reached out to Ardashir Reporter, that is his actual last name, who was a Zoroastrian from the Indian colonies who'd been inserted as a British spy in Iranian society and had lived in Iran for 15 years, gathering incredibly important covert information for the British. Ardashir Reporter noted that Reza Khan, who was one of the Persian Cossacks, was ideally suited to running the country, that he had a very stern demeanor, a very clear ability to command, and so he introduced General Ironside with Reza Khan. Now, it was a very fortuitous moment because at this point, we have discussed how the Persian Cossacks had been run by Russian generals. But now, of course, the Russians were not sending generals to Persia. They were busy fighting in the Russian Civil War. And so the Persian Cossacks looked to be without a leader. And the fear was that they would come under direct British leadership. Ironside decided, no, he would appoint a Persian that he could trust. And because of this connection with Ardashir, Reza Khan was chosen to be the Persian who would lead the Persian Cossacks. It's unclear the degree to which the ensuing events were planned by Ironside, and we'll talk about what those are. The best we know is from his journal, where it's very clear that he wants a coup to occur. He said, personally, I am of the opinion that we ought to let these people go before I disappear. In fact, a military dictatorship would solve our troubles and let us out of the country without any trouble at all. And it is certainly the case that there are a lot of disturbing silences in terms of the British record keeping with regards to what was the coup. First of all, Reza Khan was organizing his forces, and they would have passed several major British signal posts before they got to Tehran to overthrow the government. Yet somehow they magically snuck up to Tehran without any notice. Reza Khan then, in a nearly bloodless coup, used his Persian Cossacks to overthrow the government and declare himself the war minister. It's also important to note that the British didn't seem to have a design for what would happen after the coup was successful. Reza Khan's policies would not be favorable to the British, and while he did let them leave, it's certainly not an enforcement of the protectorate established in 1919. In fact, Reza Khan utterly rebuffed that peace. But at the end of the day, the British were happy that Reza Khan was in power, primarily because they didn't want Iran to fall to the Bolshevik menace coming from the north. There was a massive Red Scare in Britain, and so any ruler that could effectively hold that at bay, any ruler that could move Iran in a different direction, a direction at least somewhat more favorable to the UK, if not positive relations with the UK, at least antipathy for the Soviets as well, then that would be desirable. So not only did Reza Khan come to power, he brought along with him a politician named Ziauddin Tabatabai. For those of you who have been following, there was a Tabatabai who worked with Behbehani, but these are two different people. So Ziauddin Tabatabai had a massive reform program envisioned. He wanted to build a modern army. He wanted to end the capitulations. Remember, we talked about in the Treaty of Turkmenchai of 1828 that foreign parties had specific permissions and business rights that normally Iranians didn't have. Those were called capitulations. He wanted to end those. He wanted to befriend the USSR, not necessarily come under their power, but at least manage to have a friendly relationship with them. He wanted to engage in land reform, meaning that he would cut up the large landed estates of the wealthy individuals and create a more democratic holding of land. He also wanted to bring in westernized laws, reform the finances, and improve the taxation. In fact, including collecting taxation payments that had been in arrears. And he wanted to ban alcohol. By doing this, he managed to alienate just about every single group in the country, despite the fact that he didn't have financing to do all of these reforms that he was envisioning. He managed to alienate the merchants by banning alcohol. Many of them sold it, and he also wanted to close down merchant shopping on Friday for prayer, which they didn't like. He managed to offend the wealthy classes by forcing them to pay tax arrears that they had skillfully avoided under the Qajar. He bothered the Shah because Ahmed Shah Qajar was still in power, but he alienated him by reducing the size of the court to minimize the size of the bureaucracy that needed to be paid. And he alienated Reza Khan because he told Reza that the best way to improve the military would be with the inclusion of British officers. And of course, those British officers would lessen Reza Khan's power. So after bothering everybody for 93 days, he was ejected from the government. So when Tabatabai was ejected from the government, this is the situation that Iran was in. All these different colors represent different rebellions in different areas of the country. Some of these rebellions are not contemporaneous, but it should give you an idea about how difficult it was to control this country and how many minority groups were up in arms in rebellion. And I'll discuss several of them more in depth, but while we have the map up, there are a few that I wanted to touch on. In the southeast, you have Dost Muhammad Khan Baloch of Balochistan. The Balochi people are, they speak a different language. It's related to Persian, but it's not quite Persian. And Balochistan continues onto the Pakistani side of the border. Now, the Baloch had historically governed themselves. And in fact, during the period of World War I, they, as long as they paid a nominal tax to the Qajar Shahs, they had been in charge of their own affairs. They were not terribly excited by the tax reforms that Tabatabai was proposing, and by 1924, they had broken into full-scale rebellion. Another leader, right, is Muhammad Khiyabani in what's historically Iranian Azerbaijan, which he called Azadistan, land of freedom. And this is one of the few rebel leaders who's actually not a separatist. He was primarily operating between 1919 and 1920, and he was pushing for a return to constitutionalism within Iran, a removal or at least severe weakening of the Shah, and to promote the integration of Iranian Azerbaijan further into the country. Iranian Azerbaijan had always been the largest commercial center of the country because of its proximity to Russia. And in so doing, it tended to lean incredibly left-wing, promoting constitutionalism and supporting these sort of desires. Another group that I want to talk about is, and I've mentioned them before, are the Lurs. And the Lurs enter full-scale rebellion actually much later, closer to 1927, under a number of different leaders. Probably the most famous of them is Qadam Khair, who is the most important female leader of the Lurs. The Lurs are people who speak a language that's closely related to Persian, but also not Persian. And the Lurs are a mountainous people who generally live, at least at this point, in a nomadic situation. And they live in the heights of the mountains. That entire border region between Iran and Iraq has the towering Zagros Mountains behind it. So what ended up happening was a number of vicious attacks. In fact, it's been difficult to put together the historiography on the Lur situation because almost all the sources we have are from the Persian side. But that said, we know that there were areas that the Persians intentionally starved. We know that there are areas where civilian populations were massacred. We know that there were situations where the Persian army enlisted lures to help track down other lures, try and create factional divides. It was a very bloody affair to bring Luristan back into Iran, and that was only achieved in 1933. Now to talk about the other groups. We've mentioned Qajar Khan before, and you can see him again in the lower left-hand side. The man second to the left, second from the right, sorry, is an actor reenactor who looks almost exactly like Qajar Khan did. And again, Kuchek means small in Turkish, which is of course a joke because this man was incredibly tall. It seems to be a common thread here. And he fought in what was called the Jangal. As you can see from the background of that picture, it's a forested area. And it's called the Jangal because it's like a jungle. The forests are very thick. And it's something that people sort of forget about the Middle East, is that the Middle East actually has areas that are not, strictly speaking, desert. And the Jangal in Gilan province is very much a wet, forested area. Very easy for a rebellion to operate in. Now, the Jangalis were doing relatively well, but they were not able to take the capital city of the region of Gilan, which was the city of Rasht. And so the Soviets actually reached out to the Jangalis in order to extend the communist revolution further south. These communists were led by Raskolnikov and by Sergo Orjokonikidze. And for those of you who've been following, Sergo Orjokonikidze was pivotal in the acquisition of Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan during the Caucasian Wars to the Soviet Union. So the Soviet forces left what is today Azerbaijan and took routes to the city of Enzeli along the coast. You can see the map in the center. And they arrived at Bandar-e Enzeli, the port of Enzeli, and disembarked. When they did this, they shot quickly over the British ships in the port, and the British were so unready for this amphibious assault that they actually left significant amounts of arms and armament behind as they retreated. The Soviets collected this and presented it to Qajar Khan and his first-in-command, Ehsanullah Khan. So, because of this, there was a divide among the Jangalis, with Qajar Khan being more skeptical of the Soviets, wanting to make sure that the Soviets did not interfere directly in the future of Iran, and Ehsanullah Khan, who was more in line with them. The Soviets were able to assist Qajar Khan in taking the city of Rasht, that capital city, but then the Soviets wanted to expand to other areas of Iran, especially the province of Mazandaran to the southeast. Qajar Khan believed that it was ill-advised to make that attack. And he thought so because the forces that he had at his command were not large enough, and he didn't have good connections outside of the Gilan region. But the Soviets commanded that they go forward, and Ehsanullah Khan was willing to pick up where Qajar Khan was not. So he started the invasion of the neighboring region. But at that point, the Soviets received a communication from Reza Khan, right? That new, the new leader in Tehran, and they received a communication that he wanted to sign a treaty of friendship with the Russians to establish peaceful relations. And so on the 26th of February, 1921, they signed this agreement, and the Soviets who were in Ehsanullah Khan's division were told to not follow Ehsanullah Khan's orders and go back to the Soviet Union, resulting in a massive defeat because half of the forces that Ehsanullah Khan was bringing with him were effectively disloyal. Qajar Khan's rebellion was defeated a year later, and his head was hung on a pike in Gilan region as a disincentive for the Gilani people to rebel once again. Now, Gilani people speak a language called Gilaki, which again is a relative of Persian, but not quite the same as Persian. In the north, the western part of northwestern Iran were where the Kurds were. And the Kurds at this point were led by a leader from the Simko from the Shikak family named Simko. The Shikaks were a historically powerful Kurdish family, and they fought first on alongside the Ottoman Empire when the Ottoman Empire was invading Iran during World War I, but it continued after World War I ended. And in fact, during World War I, there had been numerous clashes between Simko Shikak and his Kurdish rebels and the forces of the Assyrian leadership, led by Petros Elia of Baz, also known as Agha Petros. Now, these Assyrians were Russian-backed and had their own militias, and there were massacres on both sides. There were massacres by the Assyrians against both Kurds and the Iranian Azerbaijani population, and there were massacres by the Kurds against the Assyrians, the latter being more numerous. In fact, Simko Shikak assassinated Mar Shimun the 19th Binyamin, who was Assyrian patriarch, at a peace conference that he had convened in order to discuss the possibility of reconciliation between the two groups. After the Assyrians lost Russian support, there were additional massacres perpetrated by Simko Shikak against the remaining Assyrian population in the region west of Lake Urmia. So we then have the situation where Simko was fighting against Reza Khan, and Reza Khan had sent his forces to retake the region, and in 1922, he was successful. Simko Shikak retreated to Iraq and reached out to Barzanji, who was the Kurdish leader in Sulaimania, what's now Iraqi Kurdistan, the eastern part of Iraqi Kurdistan. In his letter, he talks about the possibility of Kurdish union and standing together against all of the non-Kurdish peoples that are controlling Kurdish lands. He also chastises Barzanji for his faith in the Turks, because at this time, the area of Sulaimania was contested between the British and the independent government of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, and Barzanji believed that Ataturk would invade Mosul and bring the Kurdish territories under his control, which would be better than the British having those territories. Ultimately, the Turks came to an agreement with the British and were willing to give up that territory. And anyway, if the Kurds had ended up under Ataturk's rule, we talked about the Kurdish massacres during Ataturk's reign, such as the revolt of Sheikh Said and its aftermath. Now, there's a debate among, Simko Shikak returned several times to Iranian Azerbaijan to stir up rebellions, most famously in 1926. In 1930, he was invited to Iran to discuss peace terms, and ironically, considering what he had done to Mar Shimun Binyamin, he was assassinated by the forces of Reza Khan in order to end his possibility of creating an upstart rebellion. The main battle that had defeated him in 1922 was the battle at Jangali Castle, which you can see in the lower right-hand side. Now, there's a debate among historians as to whether we can say that Simko Shikak was fighting for his own power and prestige, or whether he was fighting on behalf of the Kurdish nation. Certainly, most Kurds are of the opinion that he was a Kurdish nationalist in the mold of Sheikh Ubaidullah that we talked about probably about 15 episodes ago in the late 1800s. And many Kurds see his rebellion as the first attempt at creating a Kurdish state after Sheikh Ubaidullah in the 1880s. Other historians argue that his reaching to Barzanji and talking about Kurdish unity only occurred after he'd been expelled from Iranian territory, and his primary desire was to increase his power as one of these nomadic or quasi-nomadic groups that controlled territory since the days of the Qajar. There's also Khuzestan or Arabistan, this area of southwestern Iran. Now, the map on the lower right-hand side strongly extends that territory into territories that are majority Persian, majority Lur, majority Bakhtiari, majority many other ethnicities that are not Arab, but Arab irredentism is something that comes out of this conflict. So it's worth sort of highlighting. The British, led by Percy Cox, developed a unique strategy for dealing with the situation of extracting the oil from Arabistan. As we talked about, this is the region of Iran where the Abadan refinery was built, where the British Anglo-Persian oil company was responsible for removing significant amounts of petroleum. And so Percy Cox had to come into an agreement with the leaders there. He came to greatly admire Sheikh Khaz'al bin Jabir al-Ka'bi, who you can see below. And Khaz'al was a person who maintained good relationships with many of the surrounding peoples. In fact, he was the leader of what was called the Khamsa, or the 5 entities, and the entities included Arab entities, Bakhtiyari entities, and Qashqai entities. The Bakhtiyari they speak a derivative of Lurish, and the Qashqai are a Turkic group. But this group, Khamsa, was able to defend the territory, and each group promised non-interference in the affairs of the others within their territory. In 1924, Reza Khan moved against Sheikh Khaz'al in order to incorporate this territory within Persia and to take direct control of the Abadan refinery. Khaz'al resisted with the support of the Bakhtiyaris, who were in this Khamsa alliance. But eventually the Persians led by Reza Khan were able to overwhelm all of the elements of the Khamsa and force a surrender. Sheikh Khaz'al was then invited to discuss terms on his own yacht. You can see that yacht there, with the Persians. But while he was on the yacht, it was ambushed, and Khaz'al was taken prisoner, brought to Tehran, where he was put under house arrest for the rest of his life, never able to return to Khuzestan after 1925, and the territory was incorporated into Persia. So now that we've talked about all of these sort of campaigns that Reza Khan led all throughout Persia at the behest of the Shah in order to unify the country, we can talk about also what he did in order to consolidate his power as Sardar Sepah, or war minister. So the first thing is that in 1923, he strongly urged Ahmad Shah Qajar to go on a holiday in France where he could enjoy himself. And while Ahmad Shah Qajar was away, Reza Shah was able to make a number of different reforms. And these reforms were made possible by cooperation with conservative elements and mujtahids within the government. The first one is that he created mandatory conscription. There were exceptions, however. If you were a religious person and you were training with a religious scholar, you could be exempt from this conscription. The next thing is that he tried to create a republic in 1924, taking, for an example, what Turkey had done. But it turned out that the Iranian people were not interested in a republic by and large. And so he had to sort of regroup in order to politically control the situation once more. In that time, he bought 4 Rolls-Royces in order to surveil the situation in Tehran and control what would be happening. Following that, he had to try and bring about his graces with society again. So he went to An-Najaf, which is in Iraq, but it's a Shiite holy site, in order to disguise his desire for Westernization and modernization, and get more support among the clerics. But at the same time, he wanted to improve his name among those nationalists. And so in order to get the support of nationalists, he wanted to dig into Iran's pre-Islamic history. And so he took the name Pahlavi as a surname after the Pahlavi script, which existed prior to Arab conquest of Iran. Now, it's worth just taking a second here, Reza Khan had his own last name, but he came from a relatively unknown family. His mother was a Georgian Muslim. His father was Mazandarani. And his family had no political connections. The only reason he was able to amass as much power as he did was because he joined the Persian Cossacks at 16 and proved himself an able commander. In 1925, Ahmed Shah tried to return. And at this point, the Majlis, at Reza Khan's direction, deposes him as Shah in absentia and order him to remain in exile. In fact, Ahmed Shah lives the rest of his life in Persia. And in the beginning of 1926, on the 25th of April, Reza Pahlavi is coronated as Shah in a large-scale celebration, ending the Qajar Dynasty and beginning the Pahlavi Dynasty, the last imperial dynasty of Iran. So he had a number of different policies, and so we'll sort of discuss those here. The first policy is that he wanted to expand the military. In fact, it could well be said that his primary reform and all the other reforms were done in order to expand the Iranian army. It's believed that up to 40% of the Iranian budget at its height went to the military, and it expanded to, if you include the reserves, up to 400,000 individuals by the time 1941 rolls around. You ended up with this forcible conscription that led to numerous people in the military, and that forcible conscription was primarily played by the peasants in the rural areas. When conscription occurred, the person would be dragged out of their house, and they would not be allowed to return home for 2 years, which resulted in numerous farms being abandoned, local economies being devastated, as more and more soldiers were fed into the army. Now, once the military began to be assembled, there were those who took the opportunity in order to improve their situation by moving from just the lower level enlisted categories to junior officer ranks, and then in fact senior officer ranks. It was one of the easiest ways to change class in Iran at the time. That said, these class and salary distinctions still remained, and in many cases, the poor were unable to really reconcile their situation with those who were wealthier. Because of the presence in the military, there was a significant political and cultural disillusionment. Many people felt that the country was increasingly under the control of an authoritarian leadership, and so people were disinterested in the longevity of the regime. Now, there's a comment here of, did both leaders work together? Did both Ataturk and Reza Khan work together, or did they develop their strategies independently? Reza Khan definitely took pages out of Ataturk's portfolio, but they really didn't work together. Reza Khan sort of tried to copy what Ataturk did. All right. The next thing that we need to talk about is the uniqueness, let's say, of Reza Shah Pahlavi. If we can use the quote from Louis XIV, "L'État c'est moi," the state is me, right? I am the state, there's no distinction. And that can be said about Iran during this period. We have a large degree of patrimonialism, meaning that the whims of the dictator are what are prominent, and that's clearly what happens here. In fact, he coordinates so much that the Majlis effectively becomes his rubber stamp for policies, and he is deeply distrusting of political parties. One of the main issues that he has is that not only does he imprison political figures like Mossadegh, who we'll see next time we come back to Iran in the future, who was a little bit left of center, he also bans his own party, Hizb ut-Taraqi, or the Progress Party, because it was it had dangerous Republican sentiments in 1932. You also had a massive problem with what's called routinization. And we'll talk about that more when we get to legal reforms. But when you have a government, you should develop routine policies and procedures that allow the bureaucracy to work effectively. And so in order to create these policies, though, the leader has to allow the rule of law to operate to a certain degree. And Reza Shah Pahlavi, where he was concerned, would not allow this. This includes jailing dissidents, forcing people to comply with his demands, expanding industry, all these kinds of things outside of the rule of law. Despite his view towards political parties, he did have a number of able ministers in the government. Probably the most famous of these is Abdul Hussein Temurtash. And Temurtash was the voice of Reza Khan. In fact, Reza was quite famous for being one of those people who's more like a bulldog than a man, in that he would bark a few orders, leave the room. He wouldn't say much, and had a very negative countenance on his face, a very demanding countenance on his face. Temurtash himself was much more eloquent. He had spent a lot of time in Europe and brought a number of Western ideas to Iran, and he improved Iran on a number of different axes. He was able to coordinate funding within the empire and reform the tax situation. He was able to end the concession for the French to dig for antiquities in Iran, allowing other groups to dig for antiquities in Iran, and in fact nationalize some of the remains and things that they found. He was responsible for promoting foreign education among Iranians. In 1926, he further developed the Russo-Persian Friendship Treaty into a full tie with the USSR, allowing the country to counterbalance the British in terms of influence. He worked with the Italians in order to restructure the Persian Navy, and he gave concessions to the Germans in order to expand air travel within the country. In fact, he specifically chose at each different intersection to choose a different foreign power in order to prevent any single power from gaining the kind of dominance that the Russians and British had during the 19th century. And in 1928, he was able to successfully negotiate the end to all capitulations with all foreign powers, meaning that Iranians had the same rights internally in terms of business and trade as did foreigners. Reza Khan also had internal diplomats like Jafar Kholi Khan Bakhtiari. As you can tell by his name, he was from the Bakhtiari, and he was appointed in order to facilitate the relations between the Bakhtiari clans, right, those that had been part of the Khamsa, and with the government in Tehran. You have Ali Akbar Davar, who was a legal jurist and put together most of the modern codes of Reza Shah's country. You have Arthur Millspaugh, who was an American. The Iranians had turned to the Americans again for financial advice. And Millspaugh, during his 5 years in office, was able to organize the treasury, coordinate taxation with Temurtash, and was able to set the budget. He was relieved of command, though, in 1927 because Reza Khan felt that there was a personality conflict. The primary personality conflict was that Millspaugh wanted to cut funding to the military, and Reza Khan would not abide that, saying there can only be one Shah in this country. You also had Muhammad Tadayon. He was head of the education ministry for less than 2 years, but during that time, he was able to create the Dar al-Mulamin, or the House of Instruction, the House of Teachers. He revised the curricula for most of the major schools, and in fact, he resigned his commission when the Majlis refused his desire to build a girls' school, and he would later, and after resigning his commission, he became a teacher at Tehran University in the Arabic faculty. During this period, Reza Khan encouraged the creation of a Persian nationalism, a nationalism that went beyond the connection to Islam. And in so doing, he tried to work with pre-existing cultural notes, probably the strongest of which was Ferdowsi. Ferdowsi wrote after the Arab Muslims had conquered Persia, but he wrote in Persian, and he wrote, not only that, he wrote in a Persian that was intentionally designed to reincorporate a lot of words that had existed in Persian, but had been replaced publicly by Arabic. So building the tomb of Ferdowsi, recognizing his artistic contribution, was in a sense venerating Persian language and Persian identity, separate from the Arab conquest. Reza Shah also spent time at places like Persepolis that were built by the Achaemenids. And in fact, he tried to solidify his legacy as a return to the kind of Persian rulers that had occurred during the Achaemenids, people like Cyrus the Great. And in fact, he initiated a holiday of celebrating Cyrus the Great at his tomb. You also have the flourishing of Persian literature that promotes this kind of nationalist discussion. Sadegh Hedayat wrote numerous different books about this period. Probably the most famous is what's called Bufakur, or The Blind Owl. And it's a very, I think it's a rather strange book, but it's a man who starts talking to the walls, to the ceiling, starts having deep, dark confessions about his desire to murder people. And throughout the book, he discovers that his life and his views are shrouded in superstition. They're shrouded in mystery. All these things are causing immense pain to his life. And of course, he should break free of these and embrace his true nature, his true identity. And Hidayat wrote a number of different books discussing the different aspects of Persian nationalism through character-driven stories. Unfortunately, within Iran, because of the current government, all of Hidayat's work is banned and has been since 2006. Now, there's the Academy of Persian Language and Literature, which was set up by Reza Shah in order to coordinate the language and also to remove, if possible, Arabic loanwords and replace them with traditional Persian words in the same way that Ferdowsi had. To a certain extent, he was successful. He was nowhere near as successful as Ataturk in purging Arabic and Turkish words from, Arabic and Persian words from Turkish. But at the same time, he was able to unify the Persian language in a more Persian-centric way. And finally, he demanded in 1935 that all countries stop calling the country Persia. The country had been known as Iran in Persian for centuries. He demanded that all countries call it Iran, and in fact started listing passports with the title Empire d'Iran, right, the Empire of Iran, because French was, of course, the diplomatic language. And this became the symbol of the dynasty, that Iran finally had its title outside of the country. We also have probably the most divisive issue in Persian politics, which is sartorial conformity. And what that means is that people have to dress the same way. This was a huge, this resulted in a huge number of policies in the late 1920s into the 1930s. Probably the biggest part of sartorial conformity was the fact that throughout Persia, the different peoples of Persia wear different traditional clothes. By forcing them all to wear the same suits for men and typical European-style dresses for women, they abandoned their traditional clothing and started wearing more westernized clothing. The point of this was to homogenize the various populations of Iran. And it wasn't just that they had to wear Western clothes, but that the nomadic tribes that had existed in many places were now sedentarized. They were forced to become villagers. This was deeply resisted by the nomadic forces, but they couldn't compete with this massive army that Reza Shah had put together. And so they began to live in less nomadic communities. The next piece that Reza Shah did was he introduced what was called the Pahlavi hat, which was a bowler hat. You can see it in the pictures. And he mandated that all men wear this if they were to wear any head covering. This was deeply offensive to the religious establishment, primarily because when Muslims pray, they put their head toward the ground. It's what's called sajda, or prostration. And with a bowler hat, you literally couldn't do it. The hat was between you and the ground. And so this became one of the things that the religious community became increasingly incensed about. But what really sent them over the edge was in 1936, from 1933 to 1936, there were a number of reforms with regard to what women were supposed to wear, moving them from traditional clothes to Western-style dress. But in 1936 came the worst of these, which was the kashf hijab, or the forcible removal of the hijab. Muslim women were no longer allowed to be in public. Well, women of all religions were not allowed to be in public with any head covering other than a hat. And if women were discovered in the street, they would be forcibly deveiled. You can see the chador being removed. This was more stringent than Ataturk's policy, which was that you couldn't wear the hijab in public places, but you were allowed to wear it in the mosque. The police went around, and a number of women refused to go out of their homes anymore because they couldn't cover. However, most feminists in Iran were in favor of deveiling. There was a subset that believed it shouldn't be forced, but the majority accepted that strict measures needed to be taken in order to bring women into a better position socially and politically. Under Reza Shah, the rights of women expanded tremendously. They were able to buy and sell property to the extent that a man could. They could move freely throughout the country, and they were able to study at schools. Remember, Reza Shah built both boys and girls' schools. Now, between the Pahlavi hat and in 1935, it was replaced by fedora, which didn't solve the problem, and the kashf hijab in 1936. You have a number of rebellions. Now it's from the religious establishment. Now it's interesting. The Mujtahids were railroaded quite strongly during this period. They lost a lot of their legal privileges. We'll talk about those in a bit. And a lot of waqf, or land trust territory of theirs, was confiscated. But what really sent them over the edge was the sartorial conformist reforms. And so there was a rebellion outside of Goharshad Mosque, and using the traditional bast, or sanctuary, the religious Muslims retreated into the mosque, expecting that Reza Shah would respect this historic custom. He did not. His artillery blasted the walls of the mosque. Hundreds of people were killed, thousands injured. And the police went through and arrested numerous dissidents after the mosque rebellion. Another thing that we need to talk about when we come to Reza Shah was his Tehranocentrism, meaning that Tehran became the center of development. Modern buildings, modern cars, modern streets, electrical lighting, all of these kinds of the majority of schools and universities were built in Tehran. In fact, to be assigned to a school outside of Tehran was seen as a demotion. And so in many ways, Tehran became the new center of Persia. And this was deeply angering to a number of other people throughout the country of Iran. As we mentioned, Tabriz, which is the capital of Iranian Azerbaijan, was one of the centers of trade, and prior to Reza Khan had been much bigger than Tehran in terms of its economic weight and volume. That said, because of this Tehranocentrism, Iranian Azerbaijan was a place that increasingly saw business leaving towards Tehran, and this inspired a lot of enmity from Iranian Azerbaijanis. Another aspect that we can say that Reza Khan borrowed from Ataturk was state capitalism. In fact, every single industrial factory that was built during Reza Khan's reign either had his personal or the government's investment in it, such that there was no private enterprise beyond individual shops. And Reza Khan created a number of monopolies to which he gave his friends and comrades, monopolies over sugar, over opium, over tobacco, which increased taxes on the local population. There were a number of rural peasants who increasingly felt under the thumb of these higher taxes, and they also had to pay a number of customs duties for the new imported goods. But it wasn't that alone. In the north of Iran, close to between Tehran and the Caspian Sea, Reza Shah Pahlavi purchased over 3 million acres of territory in the regions of Gilan, Mazandaran, and others. He did this in order to expand his wealth, and he made a lot of the people who had been previously living on that territory into sharecroppers. His point in doing this was to generate increased wealth to found more businesses. And in fact, he would use that wealth to begin the funding for Banki Milli, or the national bank. That national bank, instead of giving loans to bourgeois individuals who wanted to open up businesses, would only give out loans to those individuals permitted by Reza Shah to open up these monopolies and trade concessions. As a result, the grand bazaars throughout the country, not just in Tabriz, but in Isfahan as well, and Mashhad, began to lose their prominence as more and more wealth became concentrated in Tehran and in the hands of Reza's associates. One of Reza Shah's biggest goals was what was called the Trans-Iranian Railroad, and it was something that he took a great deal of pride in. It follows the track with the arrows on it that is shaded in. It was a north to south line, and one of the Shah's aspects of great pride in it was that the funding was entirely within Iran. Temurtash was able to allocate the budget using the taxes from a number of the concessions in order to fully self-fund the railroad. Now, the railroad as such was effective for the Shah in that it did a number of different things. The first is that it served as an effective military transport because it went to the hardest to control regions of the country. Regions like Ahvaz, Khuzestan in the south, the Luristani regions near Arak, and the Caspian coast. It also meant that he could ship his goods from all the lands that he controlled north of Tehran directly to the sea, and so he was able to personally profit from the movement of these trains. That said, from a commercial perspective, an east to west line, probably from Tabriz to Zahedan, and continuing over the borders, would have been much more effective economically. As we move into the 1930s, roads become more effective than trains are in terms of ease of establishment and continuity of travel. And so the Shah put together 17,000 kilometers of dirt roads throughout the country in order to connect the major urban centers to one another. One of the last things that Temurtash did during his service to Reza Khan in 1931 was that he discussed the renegotiation of the Darcy concession. Temurtash entered the negotiation saying that instead of the 16% of profits that was currently being paid to Iran, and of course that's 16% of the profits that they acknowledged, there were many ways the British avoided acknowledging which profits they were making, and so the amount paid to Persia was substantially less. But his opening bid was 25%, arguing that if the concession were being made today, it would be a 50-50 split. The British, however, played hardball, and Temurtash did not succeed in closing a deal. Reza Khan, after 2 years, was furious that Temurtash was not able to seal the deal, and that combined with British spies telling him that Temurtash could be disloyal, resulted in Temurtash's execution. In fact, most of the Shah's political supporters either were imprisoned, committed suicide under questionable circumstances, were directly killed, or forced into exile. Very few of them survived his 20-year reign. Temurtash is one of that statistic. And in 1933, he was killed. Eventually, Reza Shah was able to come to an agreement with the British that a new arrangement would be made, that there would be 20% of profits, but there would be a minimum payment of £750,000 annually, and more of the workforce would be made of Iranian citizens. Still, though, that was probably worse than the deal that Temurtash was trying to negotiate. And the Majlis was surprised by the way that Reza Khan tried to negotiate the deal, because he gave in to a number of British demands without fighting them. Now, we talked about the acquisition of land in the north, but we didn't really talk about how the small towns were really exploited and extorted during this period. The first thing is that wealth inequality was increasing massively, with the top 10% of nobility and landholders, who were really the backbone of the Shah's regime, getting significantly wealthier because of all the trade concessions that they had been given, and the majority of townsfolk becoming increasingly poorer. In many cases, Reza Khan would go to the villages and demand gifts from them, usually, and these gifts could range from territory to corvée labor. In truth, what ended up happening is that in many cases, Persians became sharecroppers on territory that they used to own. And the higher rate of taxes from all the concessions given to other Iranians made their lives more and more difficult. Add to that, of course, as we talked about, the forcible conscription, and you have these communities falling apart. That said, the social fabric did more or less hold together, especially in the more isolated regions, because at the end of the day, these groups were not affected by the sedentarization policies. They were already sedentary. And for the most part, the Tehranocentrism meant that a lot of the outer provinces didn't experience a significant amount of reforms. In fact, the Kadkhuda, or the effective mayors of these towns, more or less retained control as they had before. We also have a number of changes in education. In particular, we have a program set up by Temurtash and Doyan, which sent many people abroad. It started in the first years with a few hundred and kept expanding. And 35% of those sent abroad were earmarked to become teachers themselves in order to bring back Western education to Iran. And they did so. The number of students rose from roughly 50,000 in 1922 to over 450,000 by 1938, with the creation of numerous new schools, and the literacy rate jumped from 5% to 20% over the course of his reign. Now, that's nearly an 800% increase in the amount of people learning, and it meant that individuals were more and more capable. That said, the school's curriculum was primarily rote memorization. Reza Shah was intentionally not trying to create any dissidents, and so he wanted them only to study what could not lead to those outcomes. That said, Iranians always find a way, and so many dissidents were direct results of that rote memorization system, because they couldn't figure out how to think on their own. Now, the majority of the schools, as I said, were in Tehran. There were some in cities outside of Tehran, like Hamadan, like Isfahan, like Tabriz, but if you were outside of the major cities, there was practically no schooling to be found, and this further increased the divide between the wealthy and the wealthy and the city wealthy and the city dwellers and the poor rural population. The number of scholars coming back from abroad resulted in enough teachers that Reza Shah was able to inaugurate Tehran University by putting together a number of disparate schools of higher education and create the first real university in Iran. And Tehran University still exists today. This was the original building, the medical faculty, and obviously the curriculum has changed since then. Doyan was responsible for setting the curriculum of the university. And by and large, you began to see a bureaucratic class developing because of this education system. Reza Shah also aspired to create lower primary schools and secondary schools. And so you can see there he's walking through a Jewish school in Hamadan. And it's worth taking a moment to talk about Jews in Reza Shah's Iran. On the one hand, Reza Shah opposed all political philosophies that weren't direct affiliation with him. And so Zionists were not permitted to promote their political aspirations for a Jewish-controlled Palestine within his territory. That said, most of his policies were Jew-friendly. Many of the laws that had distinguished between Jews and Muslims in Qajar Iran, such as the situation of Najis, such as the situations of forcible conversion, these were rescinded. Jews were equal citizens. They could set up their own businesses. They could create their own schools. They were able to live lives as equal Iranians. That said, they were also compelled by all of the same laws as others. You can see the Jews there wearing hats. During the time of the Pahlavi, this is the popular fedora. But before then, the Pahlavi hat was also worn by Jewish men, and they would dress in the same Westernized clothing. So you also had Reza Shah intervening against several pogroms within the country during his early days in 1922. And the final aspect about Jews in Iran that's worth talking about is that Reza Shah was in power when the first Jews fleeing Europe because of the antecedents of the Holocaust were coming about, and these Jews would pass through Russian territory, end up in Iran, and use Iran as a staging point to go to Palestine, a mandatory Palestine at that time. So there was a huge debate as to whether this could continue, but by and large, he permitted these Russian Jews to leave, these Russian and European Jews to leave. Iranian Jews, however, he tried to prevent them from going to Israel, going to mandatory Palestine, and therefore creating an incipient Zionist movement in the country. So you end up developing this middle class from all of the industry, from all of the economic development that's been going on in the cities. And this middle class begins to demand more and more from a country that cannot provide it as of yet. In particular, the Tehran University and other institutes of higher education are turning out more bureaucrats than the system can hold. And so you end up with this educated population that is having issues finding jobs, issues starting families, because they are overeducated and the society is just saturated. At the same time, the middle class was not brought into political alignment with the regime. One of the fundamental aspects of Nazi Germany and of fascist Italy was that there were popular parties that were fascist or Nazi in orientation, to which the common people could manifest political intent. Now, of course, it's a very minimal amount of political intent. It's very strongly circumscribed by the will of the sovereign and by the will of the larger party, but it is political voice nonetheless. Persians were forbidden from doing this at all. And so you ended up having Muslim-aligned communist and Nazist groups existing underground that the middle class became more and more attracted to as extremist ideologies that could overthrow Reza Khan, or more properly, move Persia forward, move Iran forward. We then have Ali Akbar Davar, who was the legal leader within Persia, and he was probably the most organized of the reformers within Iran. In particular, he wrote numerous legal codices, primarily concerning property and concerning a unification of the various forms of the Sharia. And he divided Iran's legal system into those issues that would be handled by the secular courts and those that would be handled by the Sharia courts. And this division is actually quite common in Muslim countries today, where marital, family, and inheritance is typically handled by the Sharia court, and other issues are handled by the secular court. In fact, property registration was moved to the secular courts, and this was deeply angering to the Mujtaheds, the Shiite clerics in charge of the Sharia courts, because property registration was a massive source of revenue for them, which now shifted to becoming revenue for the state. Davar really valued honesty and integrity among the judges that he selected, and he tried to create codices that they could follow and implement. And since he valued honesty, he only allowed to judgeships those individuals, while Minister of Justice, he only allowed to judgeships those people that he felt would be honest in their dealings. And for the most part, they were. Unfortunately, because of Reza Shah's abusive policies, they couldn't routinize their judgments. They couldn't be consistent, because whenever the Shah put his finger on the scales, justice tended to go his way. This was incredibly damaging for the legacy of these courts. Davar took his own life in 1933 in mysterious circumstances. It's believed that he was either compelled or coerced to do so. Now, Reza Shah tried to reassess the board, given that he knew what his relationship was with the British, and he knew what his relationship was with the Soviets, but he wanted to make sure that he had other counterbalancing powers in order to more effectively retain Iranian sovereignty and pull Iran together and keep its adversaries out. He reached out in 1934 to Ataturk, and he went to the country again, Turkey again, in 1936. The two of them conversed in Turkish, Ataturk using his Istanbul dialect and Reza Shah using his Azeri Turkish dialect. But the two of them were able to understand each other and able to communicate about the affairs of state, creating a rapprochement between the two countries, which had, as for those of you who've been following the series, Persia and the Ottoman Empire had been enemies for centuries, but this really began a rapprochement between them. That rapprochement continued after Ataturk was on his deathbed, and resulted in the Treaty of the Sa'adabad Pact. The Sa'adabad Pact was primarily led by Reza Shah as he began his outreach to the Turks in the west, the Afghans in the east, and to the Iraqis in the southwest. And in particular, the Iraqis were willing to deal with him because it was a coalition of Kurds and Turkmen that had managed to take control of Iraq at that point, and they saw more connections with Iran and Turkey than they did with their Arab brothers. But the pact was designed to prevent foreign forces from taking apart the country, and operated as a defense for all four of the members involved. It was the beginning of a new era in Middle Eastern relations, where Middle Eastern states were coordinating together to keep out Europeans. That said, Reza Shah didn't want to keep out all Westerners. Another American to come to Iran was Arthur Pope. Arthur Pope, in particular, stressed the architecture in Iran. He was fascinated by the historical Persian styles of construction, and Reza Shah gave him permission to canvass and to diagram numerous historic structures within Iran, forming what was called the Asian Institute, that would eventually come to discuss the art forms of pre-Islamic Iran and post-Islamic Iran. In fact, during Arthur Pope's stay in Iran, Americans were well seen and continue to be well seen as a non-interventionist power that, at least nominally, was working for the benefit of Iran and all Iranians. But of course, in addition to the Americans, Reza Shah wanted additional guarantees against the Russians and the British. And the easiest way to do that was to look towards their enemy, the rising power in Europe, Nazi Germany. Hitler and Reza Shah never met themselves in person, but they had numerous exchanges and relationships between their embassies. Hitler sent a picture of himself to Reza Shah in 1936. And as I mentioned before, Lufthansa got an air concession in Iran in 1931. There was also an increasing alliance, or the beginnings of an alliance, between Iran and Nazi Germany in order to prevent what would effectively happen in 1941, which was Operation Countenance. Despite the Sa'adabad Pact existing, none of the Sa'adabad Pact members intervened when this invasion began. The British invaded from the south, the Soviets invaded from the north, and in less than a week, Iran had capitulated. Tehran was surrounded. Soviet tanks had advanced from the north. British Indians and British Anglos had conquered the southern area, and Persia was made neutral in World War II to be under this joint Soviet-British occupation. The Soviets and the British were willing to allow Mohammad Reza, the young son of Reza Khan, to inherit the throne, as long as Reza Khan would go into exile. And he died, Reza Khan died in South Africa in several years later, in the late 1940s. So what was the point of taking Iran? The first thing was that Iran was the gateway to India, and that relationship with Germany looked a little too close from the perspective of the Russians and the British. The second is that in order for the British to get supplies to the Soviet Union, they needed open corridors. And so Persia seemed as good a corridor as any to funnel resources into the Soviet Union, especially as there were train lines that covered most of the distance between Bandar Abbas, Bushehr in the south, near Abadan, and the Soviet borders in the north. And so you can see the supply convoys starting as early as September 1941, sending those supplies up to the Soviet Union to reinforce them during World War II. All right, questions, comments, concerns? While we're waiting for those, I'm going to talk a little bit about our group. So our group is History Mostly Ancient Discussions. You're here with me, Richard Sassoon, in my Middle Eastern Islamic History presentation series. We meet every Thursday at 7 p.m. And we're moving slowly through the 1920s, slowly inching our way towards the present. There are a number of other series that we do, and they're presented by different individuals in our group. You can sort of imagine each one as being its own television series with different presenters who try to see something different about history or philosophy. And we're working to provide you interesting and informative content that you can enjoy and learn about different parts of the world. I personally love the Middle East, which and my family is Iraqi, which is why I care so much about it. So You can see up there, we've got Greco-Roman civilization, you've got European Union security, powerful women, arms and armor, dead languages. And of course, we also have some short run series. We're going to go back to the Russo-Ukrainian War on October 2nd and discuss all the recent developments since the last time we met. Next weekend, as in 9 days, the Islam 101 series will conclude with a virtual Hajj. There's my Crusade series, there's Ancient Greece. There are a couple other episodes in our general series that are coming up that are particularly interesting. Dead languages, we're going to talk about Sumerian this upcoming Saturday. Powerful Women with Jane Prendergast, I believe on the 16th of September, is doing a presentation on Wu Zetian, who is a famous Chinese empress, the first time that China was ever ruled by a woman. So a lot of really fun stuff coming down the pike. And there's a comment here, excellent Iran history lesson. I'll be especially interested in the Shah's visit to the US in the late 1940s. Yeah, when I talk about Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, and do an episode on him, then there's going to be a lot more about the US relationship with Iran, because during the Reza period, the US relationship was very weak, and to the extent it existed, it was generally positively seen by most Iranians. There's a question about my spelling. Oftentimes I use the S with the caret to represent the sound sh, because I generally don't like using two letters to create one sound. It's sort of hard to pronounce, and also I try to avoid all kinds of different orthography, especially for alphabets that are not the Latin alphabet. So there's like different ways, like for example, Persians have a style of transliterating stuff into English. Arabs have a way of transliterating stuff into English. Israelis have a way of transliterating stuff into English, and those ways don't all match. And so it becomes difficult for people to sort of read how that's done. With stuff like Turkish, I really can't do anything because it's already in the Latin alphabet. But for everybody else, I try to keep it consistent. And there's a question of, does Shah mean king? Yes, Shah is the Persian term for king. In fact, it's actually come into English with regards to the game of chess, because in the West, we received chess from Persia. And the word checkmate was actually Shah-mat. The king is dead, right? Shah-mat, checkmate, yeah. There's a question. I lived in Tehran in the 1960s as a child with my parents. I was wondering if you had further history with that lineage during that time. Yes, my grandfather lived in Iran from 1955, I think, until the revolution. And my two aunts were raised there. So it's a really wonderful country. And to me, it's very sad that Iran sort of seems to totter between different kinds of despotism, especially as its people become more and more educated, more and more middle class. In many ways, the Iran demographic situation, at least to my view, as it currently stands, is actually very similar to the United States. You've got about 20 to 30% of the population that's very religious. You've got another 50 to 60% of the population that is generally non-religious. They have beliefs and things like that, but they're not extreme. They're lightly religious, and they believe in liberal values, generally speaking. And then you've got 20% of the country on the other side that's just radically atheistic or very left-wing oriented. And so it's very painful for me to see a country that looks like that have a government that looks like it does. There's a question of, do I know Christian Amanpour personally? No. And again, thank you everybody for all the comments. So anyway, I'll see everybody next week for the formation of Saudi Arabia, where I talk about the various wars that occurred in the Arabian Peninsula from about 1900 until 1930. And then the following 3 weeks, I take off. And on the 13th of October is when we return after that. And Mark and I will do a presentation together on the French control of the Levant. So we're moving all across the Middle East, because in the 1920s is when the Middle East really sort of falls apart. It's no longer under the control of these two major empires. And you have a lot of different regions sort of under their own different policies. And it's really important to set the dictators as we move into the rest of the 20th century. All right. Good night, everybody. Thank you. And goodbye.